Hello everyone and welcome back to the Airfix YouTube channel for another how-to video. This time we're going to build and paint the 1/72nd scale Eurofighter Typhoon FGR.4 starter set. The kit in this box has a simplified build sequence and a reduced parts count, making it ideal for beginners, and it's a very popular subject and it's offered in the starter set format, so the kit comes with polycement, paint brushes and Humbrol acrylics to paint the model. Everything you need for a nice basic build in one box. On the back of the box you'll find colour diagrams which detail the included Humbrol acrylic paints, the small boxes with the paintbrush calling out the individual areas that we need to paint with each colour. The smaller red boxes have numbers which relate to the marking sheet which is included, and the diagrams help with placement. Inside the box you'll find a large plastic bag, and this contains all of the frames with the model parts. Included in here is a separate bag which contains the clear frame holding the canopy. In the smaller bag you'll find the polycement and the Humbrol acrylics to paint the model, and there are two paintbrushes supplied, a size 0 and a size 4. The size 4 is larger for the large flat areas on the model, and the 0 is smaller for the finer details. The marking sheet contains all of the aircraft's markings, stenciling and the instrument panel detailing, and of course there's the instruction manual which details the build from start to finish. It's important you give this a good read before you start the project, as there are some areas which will be inaccessible after they've been glued together, and there are some parts which need to go inside, so ensure you read the instructions before you start your build. Also included is the Before You Start guide which details the common tools and techniques used in model building. We'll cover most of this in this video, but we'll wash all of the frames for our model in warm soapy water before we begin the build. The basic toolkit that we'll be using today consists of a pair of cutters for cutting parts away from the frame, a modelling knife for cutting away any excess plastic left behind by the cutters, a modelling file to file the surface flush to ensure a perfect fit, and a pair of tweezers to help with placing the markings at the end of the build. In the instructions you'll find round callouts which consist of a letter and a number. These part numbers are moulded onto the small tabs next to each part on the frame. Once we've identified which parts we need to begin, we'll cut the frame connection points using the cutters, but we'll cut them a small way away from the surface of the model. This leaves small plastic protrusions which we then have to trim away with the modelling knife, but it prevents the cutters from damaging the visible surface of the model. Any extra plastic can then be filed away to a flush finish, thus making sure that none of the connection points interfere with the fit of the parts. We'll do this for the other parts in stage 1, and this basic cleanup process is the same one that we'll use throughout the rest of the video. With the parts cleaned up, we can then test the fit without any glue in a process known as dry fitting. When we know that they fit together perfectly, we can use the yellow areas marked on the instructions to guide where we apply our polycement. Notice that we're keeping the glue well away from the edge of the parts and keeping it all on the inside face. This means any excess glue will not squeeze out onto the visible surface of the model when the parts are pressed together. Once the two parts have been placed in contact, we'll then use clothes pegs just to act as a third hand and hold everything together while the glue dries. Once this is done, we can set it aside for the glue to cure fully and move on to the next stage in the build. Again, repeating the same process, using the cutters to remove the part, the modelling knife to trim away any plastic, and the file to ensure a perfect fit. After dry fitting everything, just to make sure that we've got rid of all that excess plastic, we'll go ahead and apply the polycement and then push the parts together and allow the glue to take hold. Before long we come to the cockpit assembly, which needs to be painted with number 33 matte black before it's glued together. The paint is given a good stir to make sure there's no separation from when the kit was in storage, and then some of the paint is transferred into the palette using the number 4 brush supplied with the kit. There we can add a few drops of ordinary tap water. This will thin the paint, prolonging the drying time, resulting in a smoother finish, but it does reduce the opacity, so we'll have to build up the colour in a couple of coats. We're painting directly onto bare plastic, so there may be some issues where the paint tries to pool up due to its surface tension rather than sticking to the model. In these cases, we use short fast strokes of the brush to break the surface tension and concentrate on getting one smooth coat of paint down. When this is dry, we'll apply a second coat over the top to build up the colour, and we can move on to adding the instrument panel markings. After cutting away the instrument panel transfer from the sheet, we'll also trim away the number and then immerse it in ordinary tap water for a few seconds. We can then transfer that onto the cutting mat and leave it for about 2 minutes for the water to loosen the adhesive that holds the transfer printing onto the backing paper. When it's ready, it will move under gentle pressure from a paintbrush, and we can apply a little bit of water to the model surface and slide the transfer into position. Because there's extra water on the surface of the model, this does allow us to reposition the markings using the paintbrush to get it into the perfect place. We can then simply leave that aside to dry fully, and once everything's been dry fitted, we can go ahead and add poly cement to the inside of the fuselage and glue the cockpit into position. It's now time to close up the two halves of the fuselage, trapping the cockpit inside the aircraft. We're applying poly cement to all of the areas marked yellow in the instructions, but as you can see, we're concentrating the glue along the inner edge of all of the connection points. None of the glue is near the outside face of the model. When the two halves of the fuselage are pressed together, we don't want any excess glue bubbling out onto the surface of the model where it will be visible and potentially ruin the finish of our project. After pressing the two halves together, we've got a nice neat joint down the middle of the aircraft, and we can go ahead and finish detailing the fuselage. Along the top of the aircraft is a raised spine which is represented by a single piece that needs to be glued in place, covering up the join line between the two halves of the fuselage. We're going to add the glue again on the inside face, as we definitely don't want there to be any visible excess in this location. Once that drops into position, the join line between the two halves is completely hidden, and we've got a wonderfully neat finish. We can then add the nose cone of the aircraft, again concentrating the glue around the inside of the model so no excess bubbles out onto the surface. A tiny drop of poly cement is added to the mounting pegs for the canards, and these are glued into position and then aligned carefully with the wings. At the rear of the aircraft, a small dot of poly cement is added on the middle of the large flat mounting surface, and then the exhaust nozzles are glued into position. We've chosen to build our aircraft in flight, so around the undercarriage bays a small amount of poly cement is added, and then the covers glued into position with a nice flush fit. It's now time to paint the exterior of the model with 165 medium sea grey. This had separated much worse than the matte black in storage, so a good stir was needed to restore the consistency, before again transferring the paint into a palette and diluting it with ordinary tap water. We used about 30% tap water into the paint, and then we started to paint the model using numerous thin layers. We used the number 4 brush supplied with the kit, and because of the large flat surfaces, we ran into some surface tension issues where the paint was beading rather than adhering to the surface of the model. Shorter, fast strokes of the brush help to break the surface tension, and at this point we're essentially using the first layer of paint almost like a primer, so we don't need to worry about colour coverage. We just need to get one consistent even coat down on the model, just to help the second and third coats stick to the surface. After allowing the initial coat of paint to dry, you can see that it's a bit of a streaky mess at this point, but most importantly, there's no three-dimensional texture in the paint. We're going to build the colour coverage up using several thin layers of paint, as this will give us a much smoother finish. If we tried to use one thick layer of undiluted paint over the surface of the model, it would dry with all sorts of bumps and brush lines visible, and that would ruin the finish. Allowing the paint to dry fully in between coats, we simply repeat the process to build up the opacity of the paint finish. This could take 3 or 4 applications, but the end result will be a far superior finished model than if we just used thick, undiluted paint. Here you can see the finished result of all those coats of paint, a really nice smooth finish, and we can push on to the final stages. There are some areas which need to be painted with number 167, which is barley camouflage grey, and again we build up the coverage using thinned layers of paint. Extra care is taken around the demarcation line between the nose cone and the rest of the aircraft. At the rear of the model, the exhaust nozzles were given a coat of number 33 matte black to act as a base coat for the number 53 gunmetal. Matte black base coats help the metallic paints to have a bit more of a sheen to them, and we just took extra care when painting around the grey areas that we'd just finished. The gunmetal was then added, but the inside of the exhaust nozzles were left black to give the illusion of depth. We just painted carefully around the rim using the edge of the brush. Because we're modelling our aircraft in flight, we of course need a pilot. The pilot figure was given a couple of coats of number 163 before being allowed to dry fully. We then added some black to the 163 and created a wash of darker grey which was applied to the pilot figure, and his visor was picked out using number 33 matte black and the number 0 brush supplied with the kit. The ejector seat was painted with number 163, and after it was allowed to dry it was glued onto the mounting peg in the cockpit. The back end of a paintbrush was used to carefully push it into its final resting place. After gaining his consent, a small amount of polycement was added to the rear end of the pilot, and then he was placed into the ejector seat, and all of that was allowed to dry. The model was set aside while we move our attention to the canopy. The clear part frame was first snipped away to give us this convenient handhold. All of the excess plastic was then trimmed away with the cutters, the modelling knife, and filed flush, taking extra care as clear plastic is a little bit more brittle and prone to cracking. Once the canopy was cleaned up, we diluted some number 163 with about 10% tap water as we wanted it to be slightly more opaque. Using the number 0 brush from the kit, we then used the edge of the brush and the raised detail of the canopy's frame to guide the bristles carefully along that surface, adding some of the 163, allowing that initial coat to dry. A second coat was then added over the top to increase the opacity. If you do get any paint on the canopy's surface, you can scratch it away using the sharpened end of a toothpick or cocktail stick. The final connection point was then snipped. This was pushed into the locating tab behind the cockpit, and then the front end of the canopy pushed down until we hear the satisfying click and the canopy's in position. The final step is to add all of the markings and stenciling to the aircraft, and we'll do this in exactly the same way that we applied the transfer to the cockpit instrument panel earlier in the video. Some water is added to the surface to aid in repositioning, and the soak transfer slid into position and then allowed to dry. With all of the markings added, there's only one thing left to do, and that's to add the model to the shadow base which comes supplied with the kit. We've painted our shadow base using number 33 matte black, but you can of course paint them whichever colours you have to hand. The shadow base slots into the hole on the underside of the model, and that completes the build of the Airfix Eurofighter Typhoon FGR.4 starter set. The Eurofighter Typhoon is an attractive subject for somebody who's into aviation and wants to get into modelling. However, building a modern fighter jet which is quite large isn't always a wise choice for somebody who's just getting started in the hobby. By applying the starter set principle to the Eurofighter Typhoon, Airfix have made it possible to build a very quick, straightforward model of a very attractive subject, and somebody with little to no modelling experience will not struggle with this kit whatsoever. By applying some simple modelling techniques and a little bit of patience in building up the paint finish, we're able to get a great result straight from the box. So thank you for joining us for some modelling today. We hope you'll join us again for more how-to videos in the future. So as always, thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you again next time.